My sister thought she could just borrow my laptop to check her email. 8 minutes later, military police were at my door with handcuffs, and my entire career hung in the balance because she had accessed classified defense files that could have sent us both to federal prison. That moment did not just end our relationship. It ended the version of myself who had spent 28 years making excuses for a family that never saw me as anything more than a convenient resource to exploit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The interrogation room at Joint Base Andrews smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I had been sitting in the same metal chair for 3 hours, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the kind of persistence that makes you question reality after enough time passes. 2 agents from the Office of Special Investigations sat across from me, their expressions carefully neutral in that way that makes guilty people panic and innocent people feel guilty anyway. My hands rested flat on the table because I knew enough not to fidget. Any movement could be interpreted as nervousness, and nervousness could be interpreted as deception, and I could not afford anyone thinking I was hiding something when the truth was already catastrophic enough. Major Sarah Victoria Chan, cryptologic analyst with top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance, was being investigated for potential espionage because my sister had decided my work laptop was community property. The lead investigator, Agent Morrison, slid a printed log across the table. The document showed a detailed access history from my government-issued laptop, time-stamped and color-coded by security classification level. Most entries were routine, the normal pattern of my workday accessing encrypted communications, intelligence reports, operational briefings. Then there was a block of red highlighting that made my stomach drop even though I had already seen this report twice. Saturday, October 14th, between 2:15 and 2:43 in the afternoon, someone using my credentials had accessed 16 classified files, ranging from secret to top-secret special access program. The files covered active military operations, signals intelligence collection methods, and cryptographic key management systems. The kind of information that foreign intelligence services would pay 6 figures to obtain. The kind of information that people go to federal prison for mishandling. Agent Morrison tapped the highlighted section with one finger. "Walk me through Saturday afternoon one more time," he said. His tone was not unkind, but it was absolutely unyielding. "Who had access to your laptop during this time frame?" I had already answered this question 4 times in slightly different variations, but I understood the technique. Investigators ask the same question multiple ways to check for consistency, to see if your story changes, to find the cracks where lies usually hide. The problem was that my story sounded absurd even to me, and I had lived it. "My sister Vanessa was at my apartment," I said. "She asked to use my laptop to check her email because her phone was dead, and she said she needed to send something urgent for work. I let her use it while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I did not supervise her because I did not think I needed to supervise a 32-year-old woman checking her email on a Saturday afternoon." Agent Morrison made a note on his tablet. "Your sister works in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, correct? No security clearance, no military affiliation, no apparent reason to access classified defense intelligence. Correct?" I confirmed. "No reason whatsoever." The second investigator, Agent Reeves, leaned forward slightly. She was younger than Morrison, maybe early 30s, with the kind of sharp attention that made you aware she was cataloging every micro-expression and verbal hesitation. "Did your sister know the laptop contained classified material?" "Everyone in my family knows what I do," I said carefully. "I work in cryptology at the National Security Agency. I have explained multiple times that I handle classified information, and that my work equipment is not to be touched by anyone for any reason. I have been explicit about this boundary since I received my clearance 6 years ago." "Explicit," Agent Reeves repeated, writing something down. "But on this occasion you allowed her to use the device." I felt the trap in the phrasing but could not avoid it because the facts were what they were. I allowed her to use it under the specific understanding that she would access only her personal email account through a web browser. I did not authorize access to any files, folders, or applications beyond that single task. I certainly did not authorize her to navigate through my directory structure and open classified documents. Agent Morrison pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward me. The screen showed a detailed forensic timeline of every action taken during those 28 minutes. The log showed Vanessa opening a browser and logging into her Gmail account, exactly as she had claimed she needed to do. Then the activity changed. She had minimized the browser and opened my file explorer. She had navigated through multiple folders, opening and closing directories like she was searching for something specific. She had accessed a folder labeled Operations Briefs October, which was password protected, meaning she must have watched me enter passwords at some point and memorized them. She had opened 16 separate PDF files, each marked with classification banners, each one a violation of federal law for an unauthorized person to view. The forensic analysis showed she had not just glanced at these files. She had scrolled through pages, spent an average of 90 seconds per document, and in 2 cases had attempted to copy files to a USB drive before the system's security protocols blocked the action and triggered an automatic alert to the Security Operations Center. That automatic alert was why military police had arrived at my apartment 8 minutes after the attempted file transfer. That alert was why I had spent Saturday night in a holding room providing statements while my apartment was secured as a crime scene. That alert was why my career, my clearance, and potentially my freedom were now in question. How long have you and your sister had a strained relationship? Agent Reeves asked, shifting the direction of questioning in a way that immediately put me on guard. I would not characterize our relationship as strained, I said, which was technically true because strained implied there was tension holding something together, and there was nothing holding our relationship together except shared biology and my unwillingness to completely sever family ties. She accessed your laptop without authorization and viewed classified material that could compromise national security, Agent Morrison said flatly. Most people would consider that strained at minimum. I did not have a good answer for that because he was right. Most people would consider attempted espionage by a family member to be relationship ending. Most people would be furious, betrayed, and demanding prosecution. I was all of those things, but I was also exhausted by a lifetime of Vanessa doing whatever she wanted and everyone else cleaning up the consequences. Agent Reeves watched me carefully. We have been conducting our own investigation into your sister's activities, finances, and associations. We need to determine whether this was opportunistic stupidity or something more coordinated. Has your sister shown unusual interest in your work recently? Has she asked questions about your assignments, your access, or specific operations? I thought back through the past few months, trying to remember conversations that might have seemed innocent at the time but could be reinterpreted as intelligence gathering. Vanessa asked questions about my work occasionally, but they were usually surface level and self-centered. She wanted to know if my job was impressive enough to mention at her social events. She wanted to know if I could get her a tour of NSA headquarters to show off to her friends. She wanted to know if I made enough money to loan her cash when she overspent on things she did not need. She asks questions sometimes, I said slowly, but they have always seemed more about impressing people than about gathering information. Vanessa has always been concerned with appearances and status. My job is interesting to her only insofar as it makes her look connected when she mentions it to others. Agent Morrison made another note. We will need you to provide detailed statements about any conversations where she expressed interest in your work, asked about your access, or made comments about the value of information you handle. We also need to examine your communications with her for the past year. I nodded. I had already provided my phone for forensic analysis, and I had nothing to hide in my communications with Vanessa. Most of our text exchanges were logistical. She needed something, asked for it, and I either provided it or explained why I could not. There was rarely warmth or genuine connection, just transactional requests and minimal acknowledgement. The interrogation continued for another hour, covering the same ground from different angles, probing for inconsistencies, testing my reactions, and building a comprehensive picture of what had happened and why. By the time they finally told me I could leave, it was early evening, and I felt like I had aged a decade in a single day. I was not under arrest, but I was on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. My security clearance was suspended, which meant I could not access any classified information or even enter my workplace beyond the administrative building. My laptop had been seized as evidence. My apartment had been searched and photographed. My entire life was being examined by investigators looking for proof that I was either a spy or catastrophically negligent in protecting national security. The worst part was not the investigation itself. The worst part was that somewhere in the back of my mind, I had known something like this would eventually happen. Not specifically this, not espionage charges in military police, but some consequence of Vanessa treating boundaries as suggestions and my possessions as communal resources. For 28 years, she had taken whatever she wanted with minimal consideration for how it affected anyone else, and everyone in the family had enabled it because confronting Vanessa required energy and created drama that was easier to avoid. I had set boundaries. I had been explicit. I had explained in clear terms why she could not touch my work equipment. But Vanessa operated under the belief that rules applied to other people, that her needs superseded everyone else's limitations, and that any negative consequences from her actions were somehow unfair impositions rather than logical results of her choices. Driving home from the base, I called my parents because I knew the investigators would contact them as part of the background investigation, and I wanted them to hear the situation from me first. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheerfulness she used when she was in public or wanted to project that everything in the family was fine. "Sarah, sweetheart, what a nice surprise," she said. "Your father and I were just talking about you. We saw Vanessa yesterday and she mentioned you two had spent time together on Saturday." I felt my jaw tighten. She mentioned that, did she? Did she mention what else happened on Saturday? There was a pause, and I could hear my mother's tone shift into the careful neutrality she used when she suspected conflict was incoming. "What do you mean, honey?" "I mean military police showed up at my apartment because Vanessa accessed classified files on my work laptop," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering underneath. "I mean I am under investigation for potential security violations because your eldest daughter decided my explicit boundaries did not apply to her. I mean my career is in jeopardy, and I could potentially face criminal charges because Vanessa cannot respect other people's property or follow basic instructions." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother was silent for several seconds, processing. Then she said, in a tone that somehow managed to be both concerned and dismissive, "Oh Sarah, I am sure it is not as serious as all that. Vanessa told us she just needed to check her email quickly. She would not intentionally cause problems for you. Intentionally or not, she accessed top-secret files that she had no authorization to view," I said. "The system flagged it immediately and security responded within minutes. This is not a misunderstanding or an accident. This is a federal crime, and I am the one being investigated because they were my credentials and my equipment." "Well, what was she supposed to do?" my mother asked, her tone shifting toward defensive. "Her phone was dead and she needed to send something for work. You were right there in the apartment. Why did you not just let her use your phone if the laptop was such an issue?" I did not answer immediately because I was trying to process the fact that my mother's first response was to question my judgment rather than to express concern about Vanessa violating federal law. This was the pattern that had defined my entire childhood and early adulthood. Vanessa did something problematic, and the family's response was to minimize the action in question, why everyone else had not simply accommodated her needs better. I explained to Vanessa before she touched the laptop that she could only access her email, I said carefully. I explained that the device contains classified information, and that any other use was prohibited. She agreed to those terms and then violated them the moment I left the room. That is not me failing to accommodate her. That is her deliberately ignoring boundaries and breaking the law. My mother sighed. The long-suffering exhale she used when she felt people were being unreasonable. "Sarah, I think you are overreacting. Vanessa made a mistake. She probably did not understand what she was looking at. You know how she is with technology. She likely clicked on things accidentally. She navigated through password-protected folders and opened 16 separate classified documents," I said, my voice hardening despite my attempt to stay calm. "The forensic analysis shows deliberate searching and sustained viewing. This was not accidental clicking. This was intentional access to information she knew she should not see." Another pause. Then my mother said, "Have you talked to Vanessa about this? Maybe you two should sit down and work this out before it becomes a bigger issue." I had to take a breath before responding because the absurdity of the suggestion was almost overwhelming. "Mom, this is already a bigger issue. Federal investigators are involved. My security clearance is suspended. My career is on hold. There is no working this out with Vanessa over coffee. There are legal consequences and professional ramifications that cannot be resolved through a family conversation. I heard my father's voice in the background asking what was going on, and my mother's muffled response as she covered the phone. Then my father took over the call. "Sarah, what is this about Vanessa and your work computer?" I went through the explanation again, trying to keep it factual and unemotional. My father listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, but when I finished he said, "This does sound serious. Have you thought about how this will affect Vanessa? She could get in real trouble for this." The fact that his first concern was how this would affect Vanessa rather than how it was affecting me should not have surprised me, but it still landed like a physical blow. "She should get in real trouble for this," I said quietly. "She committed a federal crime. She violated national security. She jeopardized my career and potentially my freedom. The consequences she faces will be proportional to the severity of her actions." "Now, Sarah, do not be vindictive," my father said, his tone taking on the disappointed quality he used when he felt I was being difficult. "Vanessa made a mistake. She is your sister. Family looks out for each other. We need to figure out how to minimize the damage and move forward. I am not being vindictive by expecting her to face consequences for her choices," I said. "And family looking out for each other should include Vanessa respecting my boundaries and not putting my career at risk for her curiosity." My father was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your mother and I will talk to Vanessa and get her side of the story. I am sure there is an explanation that makes more sense. In the meantime, try not to do anything that would make this worse. You know how Vanessa can be. If she feels attacked, she will dig in and this will become a bigger mess than it needs to be." The conversation ended shortly after with vague promises to stay in touch and work things out as a family. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for 20 minutes after hanging up, staring at the steering wheel and trying to process the fact that my parents' primary concern was protecting Vanessa from consequences rather than supporting me through a career-threatening crisis. This was not new. This was the pattern that had shaped every significant event in my life. When I graduated top of my class in high school, the celebration dinner turned into a discussion of Vanessa's college plans. When I received my commission as an Air Force officer, my parents spent the ceremony talking about Vanessa's new job in marketing. When I earned my position at NSA, a role that required years of education and rigorous security vetting, my mother's first comment was asking if I could help Vanessa's boyfriend get an interview at a government contractor. Everything always circled back to Vanessa, her needs, her drama, her version of events, and everyone else was expected to adjust, accommodate, and absorb the impact of her choices without complaint. I finally went inside my apartment, which still felt violated after being processed as a crime scene. Everything was technically back in place, but I knew strangers had gone through my belongings, photographed my space, and cataloged my life looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I made tea that I did not drink and sat on my couch as the sun set, trying to figure out how I had ended up here. The truth was that Saturday's incident was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of 3 decades of boundary violations that had been tolerated, excused, and accommodated by everyone around Vanessa, because confronting her was exhausting and the path of least resistance was simply to let her do what she wanted and deal with the aftermath quietly. When we were children, Vanessa would take my toys without asking and break them through careless play. When I complained, I was told to share and not be selfish. When she copied my homework in middle school and we both got caught, I was lectured about being a better role model. When she borrowed my car in college without permission and returned it with an empty gas tank and a dent in the bumper, my parents paid for the repair and told me I should be more understanding of her financial situation. Every boundary I tried to set was reframed as me being rigid, ungenerous, or failing to understand that family helps each other. But help was only expected to flow in one direction. Vanessa could take, borrow, use, and impose without reciprocation because her needs were always positioned as more urgent, more important, more deserving of accommodation. And now her entitlement had escalated to federal crime, and I was the one facing investigation because I had made the mistake of trusting that this one time, she would respect the explicit boundary I had set about the one thing in my life that absolutely could not be compromised. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Vanessa. Finally. The message said, "I heard you got me in trouble with your work people. That was not cool. I was just trying to understand what you do all day. You are always so secretive about it. Do not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it over and over, each time finding new layers of audacity, self-centeredness, and complete lack of accountability. She had accessed classified files without authorization, triggered a federal investigation, jeopardized my career, and her primary concern was that I had gotten her in trouble. Not that she had broken the law. Not that she had violated my trust. Not that her actions had serious consequences. Just that she felt inconvenienced by being held accountable. I did not respond. There was nothing to say that would penetrate her fundamental conviction that she was the injured party in this situation. Instead, I blocked her number, not out of anger but out of a sudden, crystalline clarity that this relationship was not salvageable and continuing to engage would only prolong the damage. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed replaying the interrogation, the conversation with my parents, and Vanessa's text message. I thought about every time I had set a boundary and been told I was overreacting. Every time I had enforced a limit and been accused of being cold or unforgiving. Every time I had asked for basic respect and been made to feel like I was demanding too much. By the time morning light filtered through my bedroom window, I had made a decision. Not impulsively or emotionally, but with the calm certainty that comes from finally seeing a situation clearly after years of trying to make excuses for it. If the investigation cleared me, which I believed it would because I had done nothing wrong, I would make changes that I should have made years ago. I would establish boundaries that could not be crossed, violated, or negotiated away. I would stop participating in family dynamics that required me to absorb the consequences of Vanessa's choices. And I would stop setting myself on fire to keep people warm who would not even notice I was burning. The decision felt less like choosing to do something and more like accepting what was already true. The relationship with my family, particularly with Vanessa, was fundamentally broken. It had probably been broken for a long time. I had just been too loyal, too hopeful, or too conditioned to accept dysfunction as normal to acknowledge it. But you can only ignore reality for so long before it forces itself into visibility. And military police arriving at your door with handcuffs, because your sister committed espionage, is reality making itself impossible to ignore. I got up, made coffee, and started documenting everything I could remember about my interactions with Vanessa over the past year. The investigators would need detailed statements, and I intended to provide them with complete honesty. Not because I wanted to see Vanessa punished, though I believed consequences were necessary and appropriate, but because I was done protecting people who had never protected me. The sun continued rising over Joint Base Andrews, and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, typing out the truth in clear, precise language. This was the beginning of something, though I did not yet know exactly what. An investigation, certainly. A reckoning with family patterns that had persisted unchecked for too long, probably. And potentially, if I had the courage to follow through, a complete restructuring of relationships that had been built on my accommodation of dysfunction rather than on mutual respect and genuine care. The story of how I got here was long and complicated, spanning decades of small concessions and accumulated resentments. But the story of what happened next would be mine to write, on my terms, without negotiation or apology. And for the first time in 28 years, that possibility felt like freedom rather than betrayal. The mandatory security briefing took place in Conference Room 2B, at the NSA Maryland Operations Center 3 days after the initial interrogation. I had been informed via official email that my presence was required despite my administrative leave status, which told me this meeting was not routine procedural theater, but rather something with weight and consequence attached to it. The room was configured in the standard government fashion with a long rectangular table, uncomfortable chairs designed to discourage extended meetings, and walls painted in a shade of beige that could only be described as aggressively neutral. A projection screen dominated one wall, currently displaying the NSA seal, and a classification marking that read Secret No Foreign, meaning no foreign nationals could be present for whatever information was about to be shared. I arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality had been drilled into me since my first day of officer training, and also because I wanted to observe who else would be attending. The email had not specified, referring only to relevant personnel and stakeholders in the ongoing investigation, which could mean anything from my immediate supervisor to representatives from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. The first person to arrive was Colonel Patricia Okoye, my commanding officer and the director of the Cryptologic Operations Division where I had worked for the past 4 years. She was a woman in her early 50s with the kind of bearing that made junior personnel straighten their posture automatically when she entered a room. We had always had a professional relationship built on mutual respect, though she maintained appropriate distance as was necessary given the chain of command. She acknowledged me with a brief nod and took a seat 3 chairs down from where I sat, a positioning that felt deliberate. Not hostile but not warm either. The physical distance communicated that while she was present in her official capacity, she was reserving judgment about my situation until all facts were established. I appreciated that more than false reassurance would have offered. Over the next 10 minutes, the room filled with people I recognized and some I did not. My direct supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel James Rothstein, arrived looking tired and slightly uncomfortable. He had been my advocate within the organization, someone who had written strong performance evaluations and recommended me for advanced training opportunities. I could see the conflict on his face, the tension between wanting to support a valued team member and needing to maintain institutional integrity during a security investigation. 2 representatives from the Office of Special Investigations entered together, neither of them the agents who had conducted my interrogation. These were different faces, which suggested this briefing involved broader organizational response, rather than just continuation of the criminal investigation. They carried tablets and briefcases with combination locks, the visible markers of people dealing with information that required physical security measures, even in already secure facilities. The door opened again and Vanessa walked in, accompanied by a civilian attorney whose expensive suit and confident demeanor immediately identified him as private counsel rather than a public defender or military JAG officer. My sister looked smaller than I remembered, her usual carefully curated appearance slightly disheveled in a way that seemed calculated to generate sympathy. She wore minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate styling she typically favored, and her clothing was conservative to the point of being dowdy. She did not look at me when she entered, keeping her eyes fixed on her attorney who guided her to seats on the opposite side of the table. The physical arrangement put us facing each other across the width of the conference table, close enough that avoiding eye contact required deliberate effort. I maintained a neutral expression and focused on the empty projection screen rather than giving her the satisfaction of visible reaction. The attorney leaned close to Vanessa and spoke in low tones that did not carry across the room, though his body language suggested he was providing instructions about how to comport herself during the briefing. She nodded several times, her expression shifting into something that approximated remorseful concern, though to anyone who knew her well the performance was transparent. The final attendees arrived in a group, 3 individuals from NSA's Security and Counterintelligence Division, whose presence indicated this situation had escalated beyond a simple administrative matter into something with genuine counterintelligence implications. One of them was a woman I vaguely recognized from an agency-wide briefing about insider threats, someone senior enough that her attendance meant the organization was taking this seriously at the highest levels. At precisely 900 hours, Colonel Okoye stood and called the meeting to order. Everyone not already seated quickly found chairs, and the low murmur of conversation stopped immediately. The colonel had that effect on rooms, her command presence requiring no theatrics or raised voice to achieve compliance. This briefing has been convened to address the security incident that occurred on October 14 involving unauthorized access to classified material. She began, her voice level and professional. Everyone present has been read into the relevant details of the case or is directly involved as a subject of the investigation. What we discuss here is classified secret, and is not to be shared with anyone lacking proper clearance and need to know. Is that understood? A general murmur of acknowledgement circled the room. I noticed Vanessa's attorney shifted slightly, and the colonel addressed him directly without being prompted. Counselor Morrison, your client has signed the necessary non-disclosure agreements, and has been briefed on the legal consequences of discussing classified information. Your presence here is permitted under specific exceptions that allow legal representation during counterintelligence proceedings. You are bound by the same confidentiality requirements as everyone else in this room. The attorney nodded crisply. Understood, Colonel. My client and I are prepared to cooperate fully with this process. Colonel Okoye gestured to one of the OSI representatives, who stood and moved to a laptop connected to the projection system. The NSA seal disappeared, replaced by a detailed timeline graphic that showed the sequence of events from Saturday afternoon. Seeing it displayed on a screen that everyone in the room could view made the situation feel simultaneously more real and more surreal, as though I were watching a documentary about someone else's life, rather than sitting in the middle of my own crisis. The OSI agent, who introduced himself as Special Agent Caldwell, walked through the timeline with clinical precision. At 1400 hours on October 14th, Major Sarah Chan logged into her government-issued laptop from her personal residence in Arlington, Virginia. This access was consistent with her authorized remote work protocols and raised no flags. At 1412 hours, an individual later identified as her sister, Miss Vanessa Chan, arrived at the residence. The timeline showed my laptop activity continuing normally for the next hour, as I worked on routine administrative tasks that did not require access to highly classified systems. Then at 1500 hours the activity pattern changed. The browser opened to Gmail, consistent with what Vanessa had requested. But then the forensic data showed something that made my stomach clench even though I had already reviewed this information multiple times in private. At 1507 hours, someone minimized the browser window and opened the File Explorer. Agent Caldwell continued. Over the next 28 minutes, this individual navigated through multiple directories, opening folders marked with classification indicators. 16 separate classified documents were accessed, including 3 files marked Top Secret Special Access Program, which contained some of our most sensitive intelligence regarding signals collection and cryptographic methods. The projected screen showed thumbnail images of the files that had been opened, each one clearly marked with classification banners in red text across the top and bottom. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of mistaking these for personal documents or unclassified material. The markings were obvious and unmistakable to anyone with even basic security awareness. At 1535 hours, the individual attempted to copy 4 of these files to an external USB device, Agent Caldwell said. This action triggered an automatic security protocol that blocked the transfer, locked the laptop, and generated an immediate alert to the Security Operations Center. Military police were dispatched and arrived at the residence at 1543 hours, approximately 8 minutes after the alert was generated. The agent paused and advanced to the next slide, which showed photographs from the scene. My apartment, my laptop on the kitchen counter where I had left it for Vanessa to use, and a small USB drive that I had never seen before sitting next to the computer. That detail had not been in the initial reports I had reviewed, and seeing the physical evidence of Vanessa bringing a storage device to my apartment added a premeditated element that made the entire incident feel more calculated than opportunistic. Forensic analysis of the USB drive showed it was recently purchased and had never been used prior to the attempted file transfer. Agent Caldwell continued. The device contained no prior data and no malware. However, its presence indicates some degree of planning rather than purely spontaneous action. Vanessa's attorney raised one hand slightly. Agent Caldwell, my client wishes to make clear that she brought the USB drive to Major Chen's apartment for legitimate work purposes. She had intended to transfer some marketing presentations from her own work laptop, and had simply grabbed the drive from her bag when she attempted to save what she thought were Major Chen's personal documents for safekeeping. The explanation was so absurd that several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, and I saw Colonel Okoye's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Agent Caldwell simply made a note on his tablet and continued without directly addressing the claim, though his tone took on a slightly sharper edge. Subsequent forensic analysis revealed that the individual accessing these files spent an average of 90 seconds viewing each document, with some files receiving up to 3 minutes of attention. This viewing pattern is inconsistent with accidental access and suggests deliberate reading and comprehension attempts. Additionally, the navigation through folder structures required bypassing 3 separate password prompts, which indicates either prior knowledge of the passwords or observation of Major Chen, entering them on previous occasions. I had suspected Vanessa must have watched me work at some point and memorized my passwords, but hearing it stated as investigative fact rather than speculation made the betrayal feel more deliberate. She had not stumbled into classified files through innocent curiosity. She had deliberately prepared herself to access my system by gathering the authentication credentials she would need. The briefing continued with technical details about the forensic investigation, the damage assessment being conducted to determine what information Vanessa had been exposed to, and the counterintelligence review examining whether there were indicators of foreign intelligence involvement. Throughout this presentation, I kept my expression neutral and my posture professional, aware that everyone in the room was observing my reactions for signs of complicity, excessive emotion, or inappropriate responses. Vanessa, by contrast, appeared to be struggling with the clinical nature of the presentation. She kept glancing at her attorney with an expression that seemed to plead for intervention, for someone to make the uncomfortable facts stop being recited in such damning detail. Her carefully constructed appearance of remorseful cooperation was beginning to crack around the edges as the weight of what she had done was laid out in explicit terms that allowed for no alternative interpretation. When Agent Caldwell finished his presentation, Colonel Okoye stood again. "The investigation into this incident remains ongoing," she said. "Major Chen's security clearance is currently suspended pending completion of the damage assessment and a determination regarding her culpability in allowing unauthorized access to her credentials and equipment. Miss Vanessa Chan is the subject of a criminal investigation for violations of Title 18, Section 1792 of the United States Code, which addresses unauthorized access to classified information." Vanessa's attorney interjected smoothly. "Colonel, my client maintains that she did not understand the nature of the documents she viewed and had no intention of compromising national security. We are prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation and believe that once all facts are considered, the situation will be understood as a regrettable misunderstanding rather than a criminal act." The security and counterintelligence representative, the senior woman I had recognized from the insider threat briefing, spoke for the first time. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and taken seriously. "Counselor, your client access files clearly marked with classification banners, navigated through password-protected directories, and attempted to transfer data to an external device. The law does not require intent to harm national security, only unauthorized access to classified information. The markings on these documents make clear that no reasonable person could mistake them for unclassified material." She turned her attention to the room at large. "This incident raises serious questions about operational security, about the protection of credentials and equipment, and about the judgment of personnel with access to our most sensitive programs. Major Chun, despite having an exemplary record prior to this incident, will remain under investigation until we can determine with certainty whether this was purely her sister's unauthorized action or whether there were contributing factors that suggest inadequate security practices on the Major's part." The words were fair, even measured, but they landed with weight. My career, my reputation, and my future were being evaluated through the lens of this incident, and regardless of my innocence of intentional wrongdoing, the fact remained that classified files had been compromised under my credentials. The organization had to determine whether I could be trusted with continued access to sensitive information, and that determination would be based on more than just my intentions. Lieutenant Colonel Rothstein spoke up, his voice carrying a note of advocacy that I appreciated even as I recognized he was taking a professional risk by speaking on my behalf. "Major Chan has served in this organization with distinction for 4 years. Her performance evaluations have been consistently excellent. She has never had a security violation prior to this incident. While we must take this matter seriously, I believe the investigation will ultimately show that she took reasonable precautions and that her sister's actions represent a deliberate circumvention of security measures rather than the Major's negligence." Colonel Okoye nodded slightly but did not commit to agreement. "That assessment will be determined by the investigation," she said. "For now, Major Chun remains on administrative leave with pay. She is not authorized to access classified systems or spaces. She will continue to be available for interviews and will cooperate fully with all investigative requirements." She shifted her attention across the table. "Miss Chun, you are aware that lying to federal investigators is a felony offense separate from any charges related to unauthorized access. You are strongly advised to be completely truthful in all statements and to understand that the consequences of this incident extend beyond potential criminal prosecution. The damage you have done to your sister's career and to national security cannot be undone by convenient explanations or claims of misunderstanding." Vanessa's face flushed, and for a moment I thought she might cry, which would have been entirely consistent with her pattern of using emotional displays to deflect accountability. But her attorney placed a hand on her forearm, a gesture that seemed to steady her, and she simply nodded without speaking. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes with administrative details, scheduling for follow-up interviews, and instructions about information security during the ongoing investigation. Throughout this portion, I found myself studying Vanessa in my peripheral vision, trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from me with the sister I had grown up with, trying to understand how we had arrived at this point where she was the subject of a federal investigation, and I was collateral damage in her perpetual pattern of boundary violations. She looked diminished in a way that was different from her calculated appearance of remorse. There was something genuinely smaller about her presence in that room, surrounded by military officers and federal agents who were treating her not as Vanessa Chan, favored daughter and center of family attention, but as a security threat who had committed serious crimes that would have proportional consequences. For the first time in our lives, Vanessa was experiencing a situation where being charming or crying or claiming misunderstanding would not make the problem disappear. The federal government did not care about her feelings or her explanations. They cared about unauthorized access to classified information and the potential damage to national security. No amount of family intervention or parental excuse-making would change the legal reality she was facing. When the briefing finally concluded, people began gathering their materials and departing in small groups. Colonel Okoye approached me directly, her expression professionally neutral but not unkind. "Major Chun, I know this situation is difficult. Your service record speaks for itself, and I want you to know that you will be treated fairly throughout this process. However, fair treatment means thorough investigation, which may be uncomfortable. Please continue to cooperate fully and trust that the truth will ultimately be established." I stood and came to attention, responding with the formality the situation required. "Yes, ma'am. I understand and I will continue to provide complete cooperation with the investigation." She nodded and departed, followed by most of the other personnel. Within a few minutes, the room had cleared except for Vanessa, her attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Rothstein, who seemed to be lingering deliberately, and myself. The atmosphere shifted from formal briefing to something more personal, and significantly more uncomfortable. Vanessa's attorney checked his watch and muttered something about needing to make a phone call, then stepped out of the room with the transparent excuse of someone creating space for a private conversation he believed should happen. Lieutenant Colonel Rothstein caught my eye and raised his eyebrows slightly in an unspoken question about whether I wanted him to stay. I gave a small shake of my head. Whatever conversation was about to happen needed to occur without witnesses, needed to be the beginning of establishing boundaries that would define whatever relationship, if any, would exist between Vanessa and myself going forward. Rothstein nodded and departed, closing the door behind him but not latching it completely, leaving it open just enough that I could call for assistance if needed. The gesture was both protective and appropriate, and I filed away the observation that my supervisor understood the situation was more complex than just a security incident. Vanessa and I sat in silence for several seconds after the door closed. She stared at her hands folded on the table in front of her, and I waited without feeling any obligation to make the moment less uncomfortable. She had created this situation. If she wanted to address it, she could initiate the conversation. Finally, she looked up, her eyes slightly red-rimmed, though I could not tell if that was genuine emotion or strategic deployment of tears. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I did not mean for any of this to happen. I was just curious about what you do, and I thought if I could see some of the actual files, I would be able to understand better, and maybe we could talk about your work like we used to talk about things when we were younger." The explanation was delivered with the same tone she had used countless times throughout our childhood when caught doing something she should not have done. The tone that suggested her intentions were pure, and any negative consequences were unforeseeable accidents rather than predictable results of poor choices. The tone that had worked on our parents for 3 decades, and had trained her to believe that expressing regret was sufficient to erase accountability. I looked at her directly, keeping my voice level and emotionless. "Vanessa, we have never talked about my work like you are suggesting. You have never shown genuine interest in what I do beyond how it reflects on you socially. And you did not access those files out of curiosity. You brought a USB drive to copy them. That is not curiosity. That is theft." Her expression shifted, hurt replacing the remorseful innocence. "That is not fair, Sarah. I have always been interested in your career. You are the one who keeps everything secret and acts like I am not trustworthy enough to hear about what you do. Maybe if you had been more open with me, I would not have felt like I had to look at the files to understand. The deflection was textbook Vanessa, turning her violation into my failure, suggesting that her actions were somehow my responsibility because I had maintained appropriate boundaries around classified information. It was the same pattern that had defined every conflict we had ever had. She did something inappropriate, and then found a way to make it about what I had done wrong that forced her into that position. I did not raise my voice or show anger, though I felt both simmering beneath the surface. I kept classified information classified because that is the law and my professional obligation. Your feeling excluded from my work does not entitle you to commit federal crimes. You are 32 years old, Vanessa. At some point you need to take responsibility for your own choices instead of finding ways to blame everyone else when those choices have consequences. She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could deploy whatever manipulation she had prepared. I told you explicitly that you could only access your email. I explained that my laptop contained classified material. I set a clear boundary. You agreed to respect it and then violated it the moment I left the room. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a deliberate choice to prioritize what you wanted over what was appropriate, legal, and respectful. Tears began sliding down her face, and her voice took on the trembling quality that had always signaled to our parents that she was genuinely upset and needed protection from whoever was being mean to her. I did not mean to hurt you, Sarah. I love you. You are my sister. I would never intentionally do something to damage your career. You have to believe that. I stood, gathering my things and preparing to leave. What I believe is that you did exactly what you wanted without considering the impact on anyone else, which is what you have done for our entire lives. And for our entire lives, the family has protected you from the consequences. That pattern ends now. You made a choice. Now you deal with the results. I walked toward the door without looking back, hearing her voice calling after me with increasing desperation. Sarah, please. Do not leave like this. We need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to fix this. I paused at the door but did not turn around. There is nothing to fix, Vanessa. There is just reality. You committed a crime and jeopardized my career. Those are facts, not problems to be managed away. You will face consequences. I will face consequences. That is what happens when actions have weight. I walked out, letting the door close behind me with a soft click that felt more final than if I had slammed it. Lieutenant Colonel Rothstein was standing in the hallway, maintaining appropriate distance but clearly positioned where he could respond if needed. He fell into step beside me as I walked toward the exit, not speaking but providing presence that communicated support without requiring acknowledgement. Outside, the Maryland afternoon was cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that would normally feel refreshing after hours inside a windowless conference room. Instead, I felt hollowed out, exhausted by the performance of composure and professionalism I had maintained throughout the briefing, drained by the confrontation with Vanessa that had resolved nothing and only confirmed what I already knew. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. Your father and I heard there was a meeting today about the situation with Vanessa. How did it go? We are very worried about her. This must be so stressful for everyone involved. Please call when you can so we can discuss how to support her through this difficult time. I stared at the message, rereading it multiple times to confirm that I had not misunderstood the content. They were worried about Vanessa. They wanted to discuss how to support her. Not how to support me through a career-threatening investigation. Not how to help me navigate suspension of my security clearance. Not whether I was okay after watching my sister's crimes be detailed in an official briefing. Their concern was for the person who had caused all of this, and their request was that I participate in managing her emotions and helping her avoid consequences for her own actions. I did not respond to the text. I simply put my phone back in my pocket and stood in the parking lot watching other people come and go from the building, all of them moving through their regular days with regular problems that did not involve federal investigations or family betrayals. The briefing had forced proximity, had required Vanessa and me to occupy the same space and confront the reality of what she had done. But proximity had not created understanding or resolution. It had simply confirmed that we were operating from fundamentally incompatible frameworks about responsibility, boundaries, and appropriate behavior. And for the first time, I felt not just angry about that incompatibility but clear-eyed about what it meant for any future relationship between us. This was not something that could be resolved through better communication or family therapy or mutual compromise. This was a fundamental difference in how we understood the world and our obligations within it. I got in my car and drove home, the afternoon sun slanting through the windshield and illuminating the path forward with uncomfortable clarity. The investigation would continue. Decisions would be made about my career and about criminal charges against Vanessa. But regardless of those external outcomes, something internal had shifted during that briefing. I was done making excuses for her. I was done absorbing the impact of her choices. I was done participating in family dynamics that required me to minimize my own damage so that everyone else could avoid acknowledging hers. The path ahead would not be easy or comfortable, but for the first time in 28 years it would be honest. And that honesty, however painful, felt like the first step towards something that might eventually resemble freedom. The phone call from my parents came exactly 48 hours after the security briefing, timed with the precision of people who had spent the intervening period strategizing their approach. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing financial documents, preparing for the possibility that my career might be ending, and I would need to make contingency plans, when my mother's name appeared on the screen. For several seconds I considered not answering, letting the call roll to voicemail where I could listen to whatever message they left and formulate a response with appropriate emotional distance. But avoidance would only delay the inevitable, and I had decided after the briefing that I would face difficult conversations directly rather than continuing patterns of conflict deflection that had characterized my family dynamics for decades. I answered on the fourth ring, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Hello, Mom." "Sarah, sweetheart, thank goodness you picked up," my mother said, her tone carrying the breathy quality she used when she wanted to communicate that she was overwhelmed, but trying to hold everything together through sheer maternal determination. "Your father and I have been absolutely beside ourselves with worry. We have been trying to reach you for 2 days now. We left several messages. Did you not get them?" I had received 4 voicemails and at least a dozen text messages, but I had chosen not to respond immediately because I needed time to prepare for this conversation, and because their messages had made clear that their primary concern was managing Vanessa's situation, rather than supporting me through my own crisis. "I did get them," I confirmed. "I have been dealing with the investigation and needed some time to process before having this conversation." There was a brief pause, and I could hear my father's voice in the background asking if I was on the line. My mother must have nodded or gestured affirmatively because his voice became clearer as he moved closer to the phone, which I assumed was on speaker mode. "Sarah, your mother and I need to talk with you about this situation with Vanessa. Things have gotten out of hand and we need to figure out as a family how to resolve this before it causes permanent damage." The framing was immediate and telling. Things had gotten out of hand, as though the situation were a natural occurrence rather than the direct result of Vanessa's deliberate choices. "We need to resolve this as a family," as though this were a dispute over holiday plans, rather than a federal investigation into the compromise of classified national security information. The language minimized both the severity of what had occurred and Vanessa's agency in creating the crisis, instead positioning the situation as something that had simply happened and now required collective management. I took a deliberate breath before responding, reminding myself that I had decided to be direct and clear, rather than allowing my communication to be shaped by family patterns of conflict avoidance and accommodation of dysfunction. "Dad, Mom, I appreciate that you are concerned, but I need to be very clear about something from the start of this conversation. This is not a family dispute that needs resolution. This is a federal investigation into criminal activity that Vanessa committed. Those are fundamentally different situations, and treating them as equivalent is not appropriate or helpful." My father's tone shifted slightly, taking on the patient but firm quality he had always used when he believed I was being unnecessarily rigid or difficult. "Sarah, we understand you are upset. What Vanessa did was wrong and she knows that. But she is your sister and she is facing very serious consequences right now. The attorney we hired for her has explained that she could be charged with multiple felonies. She could go to prison. Surely you do not want that for your own sister." The question was designed to position me as the person with power to determine outcomes, as though my forgiveness or advocacy could somehow influence a federal investigation, and simultaneously to frame any enforcement of consequences as me wanting harm to come to Vanessa rather than as the legal system operating as designed. It was a manipulative tactic, likely unconscious and born from decades of family dynamics rather than intentional malice, but it was manipulation nonetheless. What I want is irrelevant to what happens next, I said, keeping my voice level despite the frustration building beneath my calm exterior. The federal government does not care about my feelings regarding my sister. They care that classified information was accessed by an unauthorized individual. They care that national security was potentially compromised. They care that laws were broken. Whether I am angry or forgiving has no bearing on those facts or on the consequences that follow from them. My mother interjected, her voice taking on a pleading quality. But Sarah, you could talk to your commanders. You could explain that it was a misunderstanding. You could tell them that Vanessa did not mean any harm, and that she was just curious about your work. Surely if you advocated for her, they would take that into consideration. They know you and they trust you. Your word would carry weight. The suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how security investigations operate, but more significantly, it revealed my parents' assumption that my role in this situation should be to protect Vanessa from consequences, rather than to maintain the integrity and honesty that my position and clearance required. They were asking me to use whatever professional capital I had built over 6 years of service to shield my sister from the results of her own criminal behavior, apparently without considering that doing so would likely end my career and potentially expose me to charges of obstruction or providing false statements. Mom, I cannot and will not misrepresent what happened to protect Vanessa from appropriate consequences, I said, putting emphasis on each word to ensure clarity. What occurred was not a misunderstanding. Vanessa brought a USB drive to my apartment. She accessed password-protected folders. She opened 16 classified documents. She attempted to copy files to external storage. Those are deliberate actions, not accidents. And even if I wanted to minimize what happened, which I do not, doing so would constitute lying to federal investigators, which is itself a federal crime. You are asking me to commit felony obstruction to protect Vanessa from the consequences of her felonies. There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of weighted quiet that indicated my parents were processing information they had not previously considered or perhaps had not wanted to acknowledge. When my father spoke again, his tone had shifted from patient firmness to something closer to frustration. Sarah, I understand you are following rules and procedures, but family is supposed to take priority over bureaucracy. Vanessa made a mistake. She used poor judgment. But she is your sister. You two grew up together. She has always looked up to you. Do you really want to see her life destroyed over a momentary lapse in judgment? The characterization of accessing classified files and attempting to copy them as a momentary lapse in judgment was so disconnected from reality that I felt a sharp spike of anger break through my carefully maintained composure. But more than the minimization, what struck me was the phrase family is supposed to take priority, the implication that loyalty to blood relations should supersede professional ethics, legal obligations, and personal boundaries. It was the explicit statement of an assumption that had governed family dynamics for my entire life. The unspoken rule that Vanessa's needs and protection always came first and everyone else was expected to arrange themselves around that central organizing principle. Dad, I am going to say something that I need you to hear completely, I said, allowing some of the anger I felt to color my tone because perhaps emotional intensity would penetrate where logic had failed. Vanessa did not make a momentary lapse in judgment. She engaged in sustained, deliberate criminal activity that has jeopardized my career, my security clearance, and potentially my freedom. I am under investigation because of her actions. My professional reputation is being questioned. My judgment is being evaluated. My future is uncertain. And you are calling me to ask that I lie to federal investigators to make her situation easier. That is not family taking priority. That is you asking me to set myself on fire to keep Vanessa warm, which is a pattern that has defined this family for as long as I can remember. My mother made a small sound of protest. Sarah, that is not fair. We love you just as much as we love Vanessa. We have always supported both of you girls equally. We are just trying to figure out how to get through this crisis without anyone getting hurt more than necessary. The assertion that they had supported us equally would have been laughable if it were not so genuinely believed on their part. It revealed a complete lack of awareness about how resources, attention, and accommodation had been distributed throughout our childhood and into adulthood. But arguing about historical patterns would derail the conversation from the immediate issue, So I redirected to the present situation. Mom, I need you to understand something clearly, I said. I am already hurt. My career is in jeopardy because Vanessa violated my trust and broke federal law. That damage has already occurred. What you are asking me to do now would not prevent me from getting hurt. It would require me to increase my own damage to minimize hers. That is not reasonable to ask of anyone, family or otherwise. My father's voice hardened, taking on the edge he used when he was reaching the end of his patience with what he perceived as stubbornness or unwillingness to be reasonable. Sarah, your sister needs your help. She is terrified. She cannot sleep. She is having panic attacks. The attorney says this could follow her for the rest of her life even if she does not go to prison. Are you really going to stand by and let that happen when you could potentially make a difference? The emotional manipulation was transparent, but still effective in triggering the guilt response that had been conditioned into me over 3 decades. I felt the familiar pull to accommodate, to soothe, to find some way to make everyone else feel better even at cost to myself. But beneath that conditioned response was something newer and stronger. A clarity born from finally seeing the pattern explicitly rather than just experiencing its effects. They were not asking me to help my sister. They were asking me to sacrifice my integrity, and potentially my freedom to shield her from facing the natural and appropriate consequences of serious crimes she had committed. Dad, Vanessa is terrified because she is finally in a situation where being charming or crying or having the family intervene is not going to make the problem disappear, I said. And I heard my voice shift into something colder and more detached than I had intended. She is having panic attacks because for the first time in her life she is experiencing real accountability. And yes, this will follow her for the rest of her life if she is convicted, because that is what happens when you commit federal crimes. Those are not unjust outcomes. Those are proportional consequences for serious illegal behavior. You sound like you want her to suffer, my mother said. And there was hurt and accusation layered together in her tone. I raised you to be compassionate, Sarah. I taught you to care about other people. Where is that compassion now when your own sister needs it most? The question landed like a physical blow because it touched the deep core of how I understood myself and wanted to be understood by others. I did value compassion. I did care about other people. I had built a career around service and protecting others. But somewhere along the way, perhaps in therapy or through accumulated life experience, I had learned that compassion did not mean absorbing other people's consequences or protecting them from the results of their choices. Compassion could include allowing people to experience difficulty that might lead to growth, and sometimes the most compassionate thing was refusing to enable continued dysfunction. I do have compassion for Vanessa, I said quietly. I have compassion for the fact that she is scared and that she is facing serious consequences. But compassion does not mean lying for her or sacrificing my own well-being to reduce her discomfort. Compassion also does not mean protecting her from experiencing the weight of her own choices. She is 32 years old. She has spent 3 decades having other people manage the consequences of her actions. Maybe finally facing those consequences directly is what she needs to develop genuine accountability and better judgment. My father made a sound of disgust. That is cold, Sarah. That is not how family operates. Family protects each other. Family stands together. What you are describing is abandonment. The word abandonment hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and accusation. It was meant to trigger guilt, to position my refusal to enable Vanessa as a moral failing, to reframe boundary setting as cruelty. And I felt the pull of that framing, the deep childhood conditioning that said maintaining connection with family was the highest value and that anything threatening that connection was selfishness. But I also felt something else rising to meet that conditioned response. It was a clear-eyed recognition that what my parents called family protection had always been one-directional, that standing together had always meant everyone else accommodating Vanessa, and that the abandonment they were accusing me of was actually just the refusal to continue a pattern where I was required to make myself smaller so she could take up more space. Dad, I am not abandoning Vanessa, I said, and my voice was steady now, no longer cold but rather grounded in certainty. I am refusing to commit crimes on her behalf. I am declining to lie to federal investigators. I am maintaining appropriate professional boundaries during a security investigation. If you believe those things constitute abandonment, then we have very different definitions of what family loyalty requires. There was a long pause, and when my mother spoke again her tone had shifted to something more wounded and distant. I do not know what has happened to you, Sarah. You used to be so sweet and caring. Now you sound like someone I do not even recognize. This job has changed you. Those military people have made you hard and cold. Maybe you need to think about whether this career is worth losing your family over." The statement was meant to present a choice, an ultimatum disguised as concern. Choose your family or choose your career. Choose connection or choose the cold bureaucracy that has supposedly corrupted your natural compassion. But the framing was false because it positioned the choice as mine when in reality Vanessa had already made the choice by committing crimes that forced this situation. I was not choosing my career over my family. I was choosing integrity over enabling dysfunction, which was not the same thing at all. "Mom, my career did not change me," I said. "My career gave me an environment where boundaries are respected, where rules apply equally, and where consequences follow actions regardless of who you are or who you are related to." What you are interpreting as me becoming cold is actually me finally understanding that healthy relationships do not require one person to consistently sacrifice themselves for another's benefit. "Your sister is not asking you to sacrifice yourself," my father interjected. "She is asking for basic family support during the hardest time of her life. There is a difference." I felt exhaustion settling over me, the weariness that comes from trying to explain something fundamental to people who are deeply invested in not understanding it. They were not going to hear what I was saying because hearing it would require them to acknowledge patterns they had participated in and enabled for 30 years. It would require them to recognize that their version of family support had always come at my expense. It would require them to see Vanessa's situation as the result of her choices, rather than as an unfortunate circumstance requiring collective management. I tried one more time, knowing it would likely not penetrate but needing to say it for my own clarity. "Dad, Vanessa is asking me to lie to federal investigators on her behalf. She is asking me to misrepresent criminal activity as innocent misunderstanding. She is asking me to risk my career, my clearance, and potentially my freedom to reduce the consequences she faces for deliberately accessing classified information. That is not basic family support. That is enabling criminal behavior and potentially becoming an accessory to her crimes. I will not do it. I cannot do it. And the fact that you are asking me to do it tells me that neither of you understand the severity of what she did or the impossible position you are putting me in. If we understand anything, it is that you have made your choice," my mother said. And her voice had gone flat and cold in a way I had rarely heard directed at me. "You have decided that rules and procedures matter more than your own sister. You have decided that your precious security clearance is worth more than family relationships. Fine. You make that choice and you live with it. But do not expect us to pretend we are not disappointed in you. Do not expect us to act like this is acceptable behavior from someone we raised to value family above everything else." The words should have hurt more than they did. Perhaps a year earlier they would have devastated me, would have sent me spiraling into guilt and self-doubt about whether I was being unreasonably rigid or failing to live up to the values I had been taught. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with the weight of a security investigation pressing down on me, and the reality of Vanessa's betrayal still fresh, I felt something closer to relief than to pain. Because what my mother had just said, stripped of its emotional manipulation, was simply true. I had made a choice. I had decided that professional ethics and legal obligations mattered more than protecting my sister from the consequences of federal crimes. I had decided that my integrity was not negotiable even when family demanded I compromise it. And I was prepared to live with that choice and whatever it cost me in terms of family relationships. "Mom, Dad, I am going to say this as clearly as I can," I said. And I let go of any attempt to soften my words or make them more palatable. "I love you both and I love Vanessa despite what she has done. But I will not lie for her. I will not misrepresent what happened. I will not sacrifice my career or my integrity to make her situation easier. If that disappoints you, I understand. If that changes how you see me, I accept that. But I am no longer willing to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. That pattern ends now." "You are being selfish," my father said flatly. "You are prioritizing yourself over your family, and that is selfish by definition." "Actually, Dad, prioritizing myself over protecting someone from the consequences of their crimes is not selfish," I responded, and I felt my voice strengthen with conviction. It is healthy boundaries. It is appropriate self-preservation. It is refusing to enable continued dysfunction. And if you cannot see the difference, then we have a much bigger problem than just this immediate crisis. I think this conversation is over, my mother said. We called, hoping to appeal to whatever compassion and family loyalty you still possess. Clearly that was a mistake. We will support Vanessa through this, and we will do it without your help since you have made clear you have no interest in being part of this family when it requires actual sacrifice from you. The accusation that I had no interest in being part of the family was so disconnected from reality that it would have been almost funny if it were not so painful. I had spent my entire life being part of the family, accommodating Vanessa's needs, absorbing the impact of her choices, and arranging myself around her perpetual drama. What I had no interest in was continuing that pattern when it required me to commit federal crimes. If supporting Vanessa requires me to lie to federal investigators and obstruct justice, then you are correct that I will not help with that, I said. If that means I am not part of the family by your definition, then I accept that outcome. But understand that I am not the one making that choice. You are choosing to prioritize enabling Vanessa over having a relationship with me. That is your decision, not mine. There was a pause and then the line went dead. They had hung up without goodbye, without any closing statement, just the abrupt termination of connection that served as its own message. I sat holding my phone, staring at the screen that showed the call duration, and feeling a strange mixture of emotions that I could not immediately sort into categories. There was relief that the conversation was over, and that I had stated my boundaries clearly without backing down, or allowing myself to be manipulated into positions I knew were wrong. There was sadness that my parents had responded exactly as I had predicted, prioritizing Vanessa's needs over my well-being, and framing my refusal to enable her as selfish cruelty. There was anger that after 3 decades of accommodating family dysfunction, the moment I set firm boundaries was the moment I was accused of not caring about family. But beneath all of those emotions was something else, something quieter but more solid. It was certainty. I had done the right thing. I had maintained my integrity. I had refused to compromise my professional ethics for family pressure. And while that choice came with costs, those costs were preferable to the alternative of living with the knowledge that I had lied to federal investigators and obstructed justice to protect someone who had betrayed my trust and jeopardized my career. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Vanessa, and the preview showed enough of the message to make clear it was long and emotional. I did not open it immediately, choosing instead to let it sit unread while I processed the conversation with my parents and prepared myself mentally for whatever Vanessa had sent. When I finally opened the message, it was approximately what I had expected. Multiple paragraphs about how hurt she was that I was not supporting her, how she could not believe I was being so cold during the hardest time of her life, how she had always looked up to me and thought I would be there for her when she needed me most. There were references to our childhood, memories of times when I had helped her with homework or defended her from bullies or covered for her when she got in trouble. There were accusations that I had changed, that I was not the person she thought I was, that my job had made me into someone who cared more about rules than about people. The message ended with a paragraph that was clearly meant to be devastating. I guess I finally see who you really are, Sarah. You are someone who would rather see your own sister go to prison than admit that maybe you were partly responsible for what happened by being so secretive about your work. You pushed me away for years with your security clearance and you're classified this in your need to know that. And now you are acting like I am the only one who did something wrong. But at least I was trying to connect with you. At least I was trying to understand your life. What were you trying to do except keep me at a distance? The attempt to reframe her criminal behavior as my fault for maintaining appropriate security boundaries was so audacious that it almost demanded admiration for sheer manipulative creativity. She had managed to take her deliberate violation of federal law and transform it into a story where she was the victim of my emotional unavailability, where her crimes were actually attempts at connection, and where I was the villain for enforcing boundaries that prevented her from accessing classified national security information. I read the message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of deflection, blame shifting, and fundamental refusal to accept accountability. And with each reading, I felt the last remaining threads of obligation and guilt dissolving into something cleaner and simpler. This was who Vanessa was. This was how she operated. And nothing I said or did would change that because she was deeply invested in a narrative where she was always the wronged party, and everyone else was always failing to accommodate her needs appropriately. I did not respond to her message. There was nothing to say that would penetrate her carefully constructed version of reality, and attempting to engage would only provide her with more material to twist into evidence of my cruelty or coldness. Instead, I took a screenshot of the message and saved it to a folder I had created for documentation related to the investigation. If investigators needed to see evidence of Vanessa's mindset and her attempts to manipulate family members into supporting false narratives, I now had that evidence preserved. Then I blocked her number. Not out of anger, though I certainly felt angry. Not out of spite, though blocking her would undoubtedly be interpreted that way. But out of a clear recognition that continued contact with Vanessa was not healthy for me, was not helping the investigation, and was not serving any productive purpose. She had said what she wanted to say. I had heard it. Now I was choosing to end a communication channel that had only ever functioned to deliver demands, accusations, and emotional manipulation. The blocking process took less than 30 seconds, a few taps on my phone screen that severed a communication channel that had existed for my entire life. When it was done, I set my phone face down on the table and sat in the quiet of my apartment, noticing how the space felt different now. Lighter, perhaps. Or maybe just less cluttered with obligations that had never been genuinely mutual. I made tea that I did not drink and sat watching the afternoon light shift across my living room wall, processing what had just occurred. In the span of a single phone call and one text message exchange, I had effectively ended my relationships with my parents and my sister by refusing to compromise my integrity to protect Vanessa from consequences she had earned. They would characterize this as me choosing my career over family. I understood it as refusing to enable criminal behavior and maintaining boundaries necessary for my own well-being. The difference between those two interpretations was the difference between two completely incompatible worldviews. In my family's framework, loyalty meant protecting each other from consequences regardless of whether those consequences were deserved. In my framework, loyalty meant caring about people enough to tell them the truth and allow them to grow through experiencing the results of their choices. Neither perspective was objectively right or wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible, and trying to maintain relationships across that gap had become unsustainable. My phone remained silent for the rest of the afternoon, which told me that Vanessa had likely contacted our parents about my blocking her, and they had collectively decided that I was the problem requiring management. There would probably be additional attempts at contact, perhaps through extended family members or mutual acquaintances, but for now I had a period of quiet to process and prepare for whatever came next. That evening I drafted an email to Lieutenant Colonel Rothstein documenting the conversation with my parents and Vanessa's message. I included screenshots and verbatim quotes where possible, maintaining professional tone and factual precision. I was not seeking sympathy or validation. I was creating a record that investigators could reference if questions arose about family pressure or attempts to influence my statements. The documentation was strategic and necessary, part of protecting myself in a situation where I was increasingly isolated from family support, but needed to demonstrate continued cooperation and transparency with the investigation. When I finished the email, I saved it to drafts rather than sending immediately. I would review it in the morning with fresh eyes and send it if it still seemed appropriate after reflection. For now I was simply tired. Tired of defending boundaries that should have been obvious. Tired of explaining why refusing to commit crimes was not the same as abandoning family. Tired of being treated as the problem in a situation entirely created by someone else's choices. But beneath the tiredness was something else. It was a growing sense of clarity about what came next. The family relationships that had defined my first 28 years were effectively over, not because I had abandoned them but because I had refused to continue enabling dysfunction. The career I had built was in jeopardy, but I had maintained my integrity throughout the crisis, and would continue to do so regardless of outcomes. And the version of myself that had accommodated others at cost to my own well-being was being replaced by someone who understood that self-preservation was not selfishness. I did not know yet what my life would look like when the investigation concluded, whether I would still have a career in intelligence or would need to rebuild in an entirely different direction. I did not know whether my family would eventually come to understand my position, or would permanently view me as the person who abandoned Vanessa in her time of need. I did not know how many other relationships would be damaged as people chose sides or decided that my boundary setting made me too difficult or too cold. What I did know was that I had drawn a line. I had stated clearly what I would and would not do, what I would and would not tolerate, What I would and would not sacrifice for the sake of maintaining connections that had always required me to make myself smaller. And having drawn that line, having stated those boundaries, having made those choices, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. I felt like myself. Not the accommodating version who absorbed other people's chaos. Not the good daughter who prioritized family harmony over personal integrity. Not the easy sibling who adjusted to make room for Vanessa's constant drama. But the person I actually was beneath all of those adaptations. Someone with clear values, firm boundaries, and unwillingness to compromise core principles for social comfort. That person was someone I was just beginning to know. Someone I was still discovering through this crisis. And while the circumstances forcing that discovery were painful and costly, the person emerging from them was someone I could respect, someone I could trust, someone I could build a future with. The sun set over Arlington, and I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, not turning on lights yet, just existing in the space between what had been and what would come next. The transition was not complete. The investigation continued. Decisions remained ahead. But the foundation had been laid, the boundaries had been stated, and the path forward, however uncertain, was at least my own to walk. And that, I was beginning to understand, was worth whatever it cost. The memory that kept surfacing during the quiet hours after blocking my family was not dramatic or obviously traumatic. It was mundane, which somehow made it more painful because mundane moments are the ones that reveal patterns rather than aberrations. I was 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a certificate for Student of the Month, waiting for someone to notice. Vanessa had been 13 then. In the complicated middle school years where everything felt like a crisis and our parents had learned to brace themselves for daily emotional emergencies. That particular afternoon, she had come home upset because her science teacher had given her a B on a project that she insisted deserved an A. The project was still in her backpack, ungraded and not yet returned, but she had seen the teacher writing grades in her gradebook and was certain the B she glimpsed was hers. My mother had immediately shifted into crisis management mode, asking questions about the project requirements, whether the rubric had been followed, whether there was any possibility of grade revision. My father had joined the conversation from the living room, offering to email the teacher or schedule a parent conference if needed. The kitchen had filled with concerned energy, everyone focused on the potential injustice of Vanessa receiving a grade she had not yet actually received but was preparing to contest preemptively. I had sat there with my certificate, which represented a month of perfect attendance, completed homework, helpful classroom participation, and teacher nomination based on overall character and effort. It was not an enormous achievement, but at 9 years old it had felt significant. I had been proud. I had imagined showing it to my parents and seeing them smile, maybe putting it on the refrigerator alongside Vanessa's various participation ribbons and team photos. But the moment never came. The conversation about the imaginary B continued through dinner. My certificate remained in my folder, unmentioned and unnoticed. When I finally tried to show it to my mother while she was cleaning up after the meal, she had glanced at it for approximately 3 seconds and said, "That's wonderful, sweetie," before immediately returning her attention to loading the dishwasher and continuing her conversation with my father about whether they should proactively email Vanessa's teacher or wait to see what grade was actually assigned. The certificate had ended up in a drawer in my room, and I never mentioned it again because I had learned something important that afternoon. My achievements, no matter how hard-won or meaningful to me, would always be secondary to Vanessa's crises, real or imagined. Attention was a finite resource in our household, and Vanessa had established early and firmly that she would consume the majority of it. That pattern had not begun with the certificate incident, and it certainly had not ended there. Looking back from my current perspective as an adult with enough therapy and self-reflection to analyze childhood dynamics, I could trace the pattern back to my earliest memories. Vanessa had been the firstborn, arriving 4 years before me, and she had established herself as the sun around which the family system orbited. I had been born into a household where the roles were already assigned, where the hierarchy was already clear, where the distribution of attention and resources was already decided. I was not unloved. That was important to acknowledge because it would have been easier in some ways if I had been overtly rejected or clearly unwanted. But I was not. My parents loved me in the abstract way people love children they brought into the world. They provided food, shelter, medical care, and basic emotional support. They attended my school events when those events did not conflict with Vanessa's schedule. They showed interest in my activities when those activities were brought to their attention in ways that could not be ignored. But love, I had learned, was not the same as attention. And attention was not the same as prioritization. My parents could love both their children while consistently treating one as more important, more interesting, more deserving of the family's collective focus. That was what had happened. Not through any single decision but through thousands of small choices about where to direct their energy, their concern, their celebration, and their intervention. Vanessa had been a difficult baby, according to family stories told and retold until they became part of our household mythology. She had cried frequently, slept poorly, and demanded constant attention. My parents had risen to meet those demands because that is what parents do. But in the process they had established a pattern where Vanessa's needs set the agenda and everyone else adjusted around them. When I arrived 4 years later, I had apparently been an easy baby by comparison. I slept through the night early, entertained myself contentedly, and rarely fussed. My parents had been relieved, grateful for a child who did not require the intensive management that Vanessa had demanded. But easy children, I had learned, face their own challenges. When you do not demand attention, you often do not receive it. When you manage your own needs competently, adults assume you do not need support. When you solve your own problems quietly, no one notices the problems existed in the first place. I had become invisible not through neglect but through competence. Not through malice but through family systems adapting to the loudest voices and the most pressing needs. Elementary school had been full of moments that established and reinforced this dynamic. Vanessa had joined every activity available: soccer, dance, choir, drama club, and something called junior entrepreneurs that met on Saturday mornings. Each activity required transportation, equipment, fees, and parental attendance at performances and competitions. My parents' calendars had been completely consumed by Vanessa's schedule, their weekends structured around her commitments, their conversation dominated by her latest achievement or social drama. I had tried to join activities too, but my attempts had been met with gentle discouragement framed as practical concern. My mother had explained that I should wait until I was older to join multiple activities because she and my father were already stretched thin with Vanessa's commitments. My father had suggested I pick one thing rather than several so I could really focus and excel at it. The subtext beneath these suggestions had been clear. We do not have capacity for another child with extensive extracurricular involvement, so you need to scale your expectations accordingly. I had chosen art classes at the community center because they met during the day on Saturdays when Vanessa had her junior entrepreneurs meeting, which meant my mother could drop me off at the same time and pick us both up without requiring multiple trips. The classes had been wonderful, 3 hours each week where I learned watercolor techniques, perspective drawing, and clay sculpture from a teacher who noticed when students showed talent and gave individual attention to developing their skills. I had loved those classes and had created pieces I was genuinely proud of. But when the community center held a student exhibition at the end of the semester, my parents had not attended because it conflicted with one of Vanessa's dance recitals. My teacher had saved my artwork for me, 3 pieces that had been displayed with small description cards bearing my name and age. I had brought them home and shown them to my parents, who had said they were lovely and suggested I keep them in my room where I could enjoy them. Vanessa's dance recital, by contrast, had been documented with extensive photography, discussed in detail over the following weeks, and used as justification for enrolling her in additional intensive dance training that required an even greater commitment of family time and resources. The contrast had not been intentional cruelty on anyone's part. It had simply been the logical extension of a pattern where Vanessa's activities were treated as significant family events and mine were treated as personal hobbies that I pursued independently. School itself had revealed similar dynamics. I had been a strong student, consistently earning high grades through careful attention and completed work. Report cards in our house arrived quarterly, and mine had always been solid. Mostly A's, a few B's in subjects that challenged me, and teacher comments noting that I was conscientious, attentive, and pleasant to have in class. My parents had reviewed these report cards briefly, expressed satisfaction, and then filed them away without much discussion. Vanessa's report cards, regardless of the grades they contained, had generated extensive conversation. If she received strong marks, there was celebration and discussion of her intelligence and potential. If she received weaker marks, There was analysis of what had gone wrong, strategizing about how to improve, and often contact with teachers to understand the grading criteria and explore opportunities for grade revision or extra credit. Either way, her academic performance was treated as a matter requiring family attention and intervention. Mine was treated as something I managed independently, which was both a vote of confidence in my capability and an indication that my education was not considered a shared family project in the way that hers was. The most telling example had come in 6th grade when we had both received recognition at our respective schools during the same week. I had been selected as one of 3 students to represent my elementary school at a district-wide science competition. The selection had been based on a proposal I had written for a project investigating water quality in local streams, combining environmental science with practical data collection. I had worked on the proposal for weeks, revising it multiple times based on teacher feedback, and I had been genuinely excited when I learned I had been chosen. Vanessa, during that same week, had been given a small role in the high school musical even though she was only in 8th grade. The role had 3 lines and appeared in 2 scenes, but it represented the first time a middle school student had been cast in the high school production, which the director had announced as evidence of Vanessa's exceptional talent. My parents had been thrilled, immediately beginning to plan how to attend every performance, discussing whether we should invite extended family, and purchasing flowers in advance to present to Vanessa after opening night. My science competition had been scheduled for the same weekend as Vanessa's musical performances. The competition ran Saturday morning through early afternoon, with awards presented at 2 o'clock. Vanessa's musical had performances Friday evening, Saturday evening, and Sunday matinee. My parents had briefly discussed logistics, trying to determine whether they could attend both events, but the conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes before they concluded that they needed to attend all of Vanessa's performances since she was part of an ensemble and would notice their absence. They had suggested my grandmother could take me to the science competition since she lived nearby, and would probably enjoy seeing me present my project. I had competed with my grandmother in the audience, one small woman in a sea of parents and families who had come to support their students. My project had taken 2nd place in the middle school division, which I had been proud of until I learned that 1st place came with a trophy and an invitation to state competition, while 2nd place received a certificate and a firm handshake. I had tried not to care, had tried to tell myself that 2nd place was still an accomplishment, but standing there watching the 1st place winner take photos with her parents and trophy, I had felt the weight of being secondary, of being the child whose achievements were good but not quite significant enough to warrant full parental attention. My grandmother had taken me out for ice cream afterward, and she had been genuinely congratulatory and interested in my project. But she had also made a comment that had stuck with me for years. She had said, with the blunt honesty that elderly people sometimes employ, "Your parents don't mean to overlook you, sweetheart. Vanessa just needs more attention, and they're giving her what she needs. You're more self-sufficient, which is actually a wonderful quality. It means you'll be fine no matter what life throws at you." At 12 years old, I had not fully understood what my grandmother was telling me, but I had felt the message beneath her words. I was overlooked not because I was less worthy but because I was more capable. I received less attention not because I was loved less but because I required less maintenance. I was being trained, through benign neglect and consistent secondary prioritization, to not need anyone. And my grandmother, who loved me but who had raised my mother in a similar dynamic, saw this as a positive outcome rather than as a loss. Middle school had continued the pattern with increasing clarity. Vanessa's high school years had been full of drama, both literal and figurative. She had gone through friendship crises, romantic entanglements, academic struggles, extracurricular competitions, and the normal turbulence of adolescence, all of which had been processed and managed through extensive family discussion and parental intervention. My parents had been active in her high school experience, attending parent-teacher conferences, communicating regularly with her guidance counselor, monitoring her social media for concerning posts, and maintaining awareness of her emotional state with careful attention. My middle school experience had been almost entirely independent by comparison. I had attended parent-teacher conferences that my parents scheduled, but often had to reschedule or cancel due to conflicts with Vanessa's needs. I had managed my own homework, projects, and study schedule without assistance or oversight. I had navigated friendship dynamics, academic challenges, and the social complexity of adolescence without bringing those struggles to my parents, because I had learned that their capacity for managing teenage emotional crises was entirely consumed by Vanessa. I was not bullied or struggling in ways that would have demanded intervention. I had friends, adequate social inclusion, and reasonable confidence in my ability to handle most situations I encountered. But I had also been lonely in a way that was hard to articulate, the loneliness of being functionally independent before being emotionally ready for that independence, of having competence mistaken for not needing support. One memory from 8th grade stood out with particular clarity. I had been struggling in algebra, not failing but not understanding the concepts as quickly as the teacher presented them. I had stayed after class several times for extra help, had worked through practice problems until the methods started making sense, and had eventually brought my grade up from a C to a B through sustained effort. The improvement had felt significant to me, evidence that I could overcome academic challenges through persistence and willingness to seek help. I had mentioned my grade improvement to my parents at dinner one evening, thinking they might be pleased that I had taken initiative to address a struggling area. My mother had said, "That's great, honey," and then immediately turned to Vanessa to ask about her chemistry test that she knew had been scheduled for that day. Vanessa had launched into a lengthy explanation of how the test had been unfairly difficult, and how she thought the teacher had included material that had not been adequately covered in class. The conversation about my algebra grade had lasted approximately 6 seconds before being displaced by Vanessa's chemistry grievances, which had dominated the remainder of dinner. I had finished my meal in silence, listening to my parents discuss whether Vanessa should talk to the teacher about the test difficulty, whether there might be opportunities for retake or extra credit, and whether the chemistry teacher's grading standards were consistent with other teachers in the department. No one had asked me what had been difficult about algebra. No one had inquired what strategies I had used to improve my understanding. No one had acknowledged that self-directed academic recovery was actually a more valuable skill than I had been given credit for developing. That night I had gone to my room and cried quietly, not from any specific acute hurt but from the accumulated weight of being consistently secondary. I had cried for all the achievements that had been acknowledged briefly and then forgotten, for all the struggles I had managed alone because bringing them to my parents would have just added to their already overburdened capacity, for all the times I had made myself smaller and quieter and less demanding so that family resources could flow toward Vanessa without conflict or competition. But I had also learned something important that night. I had learned that I could not rely on my parents to notice or care about my internal experience unless I made it impossible to ignore. And I had learned that making things impossible to ignore required creating the kind of drama and crisis that Vanessa generated naturally, but that felt foreign and uncomfortable to my personality. I could either continue being overlooked by remaining myself, or I could attempt to compete for attention through becoming someone I was not. I had chosen to remain myself, which meant accepting that I would continue to be secondary. It was not a conscious decision so much as a recognition of reality, and a calculation that trying to compete with Vanessa for parental attention would damage me more than accepting my position in the family hierarchy. I had doubled down on competence, on independence, on managing my own needs with minimal support, telling myself that this was making me stronger and more capable even as part of me understood that it was also making me invisible. High school had been 4 years of that pattern intensifying. Vanessa had been in college by then, attending a university 2 hours away, but her physical absence had not reduced her dominance of family attention. She had called constantly with roommate conflicts, academic challenges, dating drama, and financial needs that arose from consistently overspending her carefully budgeted allowance. My parents had remained emotionally and financially engaged with her college experience, visiting frequently, managing her crises remotely, and organizing family logistics around her schedule when she came home for breaks and holidays. I had been attending the same high school Vanessa had graduated from, walking the same hallways, taking classes with some of the same teachers. The teachers who remembered her had often made comments comparing us, noting that I was quieter than my sister, more serious, less socially connected. The comparisons had not been mean-spirited, just observational, but they had reinforced what I already knew. Vanessa left impressions on people, created memories, made herself memorable through force of personality. I moved through spaces leaving minimal trace, competent but unremarkable, capable but forgettable. My parents had attended my high school events with noticeably less enthusiasm than they had shown for Vanessa's. They had come to my orchestra concerts but had often arrived late or left early to accommodate other commitments. They had reviewed my report cards with increasingly brief comments, satisfaction with good grades, but no deeper engagement with what I was learning, or what interested me academically. They had helped me with college applications only when I specifically requested assistance, treating the process as something I was managing independently rather than as a family project requiring collective investment. The contrast had been most visible around college decision time. When Vanessa had been applying to colleges, the process had consumed months of family attention. My parents had toured campuses with her, discussed the merits of different programs, helped her craft application essays, and celebrated each acceptance letter with genuine excitement. They had created comparison spreadsheets analyzing cost, location, program strength, and campus culture for every school she was considering. The final decision had been made through family discussion, with everyone contributing thoughts about which environment would serve Vanessa best. When my turn came 2 years later, I had researched schools independently, scheduled my own campus tours, written my own essays, and submitted applications without much family involvement. My parents had been available when I asked direct questions, but they had not initiated conversations about college or shown active interest in my decision-making process. When my acceptance letters arrived, they had congratulated me and asked which school I planned to attend, treating the choice as mine to make rather than as a family decision requiring collective input. I had chosen the Air Force Academy, partly because it offered an excellent education with full financial support, partly because I was drawn to the structure and clear meritocracy of military service, but mostly because it was far from home and would give me independence from family dynamics that had become increasingly painful to navigate. My parents had been surprised by my choice, having assumed I would attend a traditional civilian university closer to home. But they had not questioned my decision extensively, or tried to influence me toward other options. They had simply accepted that this was what I wanted and moved forward with preparations for my departure. The day I had left for the academy, my mother had cried and hugged me tightly, telling me she was proud of me and would miss me. My father had given me advice about working hard and making the most of the opportunity. Vanessa had been present for the send-off, home from college for the summer, and she had hugged me and said she could not believe her little sister was going to be in the military. The moment had felt significant, a family coming together to mark a major transition. But within an hour of arriving at the academy and beginning in processing, I had received 3 text messages from my mother. The first asked if I had arrived safely. The second asked if I remembered that Vanessa had a dentist appointment the following week, and could I send her the information about what insurance card she should bring. The third was a photo of Vanessa with my parents, taken at the breakfast they had gone to after dropping me off, with a caption about treating themselves to a nice meal after the emotional morning. I had stared at those messages, understanding in a crystallized moment that even my departure for military service, even this significant milestone in my life, was being absorbed back into the familiar pattern where Vanessa remained central and I remained peripheral. They had driven 5 hours to drop me off, had participated in the goodbye, and had immediately returned their attention to Vanessa's routine needs and their own comfort. The significance of the day had been acknowledged briefly and then filed away as complete, a task checked off the list, allowing them to return to normal operations. That realization had hurt, but it had also liberated me in an unexpected way. I had been released from hoping that things would change, from believing that eventually my parents would see me as equally important to Vanessa, from waiting for the moment when I would finally receive the sustained attention and investment that she had always received. I understood with adult clarity that the pattern was set, that my parents loved me but would never prioritize me the way they prioritized her, and that accepting that reality would hurt less than continuing to hope for something different. The academy had been exactly what I needed, an environment where your family background was irrelevant, and your performance was everything. No one cared whether you were the favored child or the overlooked one. No one asked about sibling dynamics or family relationships. You were evaluated solely on your ability to meet standards, follow instructions, learn quickly, and demonstrate the character traits necessary for military leadership. For the first time in my life, I had been in an environment where being competent and self-sufficient was valued, rather than being misinterpreted as not needing support. I had thrived at the academy, not because military life came naturally to me, but because I had spent 18 years learning to manage difficulty independently, to solve problems without extensive support, and to persist through challenges without expecting anyone to notice or intervene. The skills I had developed through being overlooked in my family system had translated directly into military success. I had been prepared for the Academy's demands in ways that many of my peers, coming from families that had provided extensive support and guidance, had not been. But success had not healed the underlying wound. Achievement had not replaced the need to be seen, to be known, to matter to the people who were supposed to matter most. I had graduated with honors, received my commission as a second lieutenant, and moved into my military career with purpose and direction. But I had also carried with me the accumulated weight of 2 decades of being secondary, of being the child who was loved but not prioritized, supported but not celebrated, acknowledged but not truly seen. That weight had shaped how I understood relationships, how I evaluated my own worth, and how I responded to situations where I might be overlooked or undervalued. I had developed hypervigilance about being taken for granted, sensitivity to being treated as less important than others, and a tendency to withdraw from relationships where I felt myself slipping into familiar patterns of being the person who accommodated while others consumed. Sitting in my apartment after blocking my family, I understood that the current crisis was not really about Vanessa accessing classified files. The files were the catalyst, the undeniable external event that forced confrontation, but the real issue was the pattern they represented. Vanessa taking what she wanted without regard for consequences, my parents prioritizing her needs over my well-being, and me being expected to absorb the damage while continuing to maintain family relationships as though nothing significant had occurred. That pattern had started before I could walk, had been reinforced through thousands of small interactions and decisions, and had culminated in a security breach that threatened my career and potentially my freedom. But the pattern itself, the fundamental dynamic of me being secondary and Vanessa being central, was something I had lived with for 28 years before it finally manifested in a form that could not be minimized, excused, or accommodated away. Understanding that history, seeing the full arc of how I had arrived at this moment, did not make the current situation easier. But it did make my choices clearer. I was not abandoning my family over one incident. I was refusing to continue a pattern that had required me to consistently make myself smaller, quieter, and less important so that family resources and attention could flow toward Vanessa without conflict. The child who had sat at the kitchen table with a Student of the Month certificate, waiting to be noticed and learning that she would not be, had grown into an adult who understood that being overlooked was not evidence of her inadequacy but rather evidence of a dysfunctional family system. And that adult was choosing, finally and firmly, to stop participating in that system regardless of what that choice cost in terms of family relationships. It was not cruelty. It was not selfishness. It was not failure to value family. It was simply the decision to stop setting herself on fire to keep other people warm, to stop accepting secondary position as though it were the natural and appropriate order of things, to stop believing that love without prioritization was sufficient foundation for healthy family relationships. And if that decision meant losing connections to people who had never quite seen her anyway, then perhaps what was being lost was an illusion that had never reflected reality in the first place. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it felt like permission to finally stop trying to earn something that had never been available to begin with. And in that permission was the first glimpse of what freedom might actually feel like. The years between graduating from the Air Force Academy and the current security crisis had been characterized by a slow, steady process of learning how to function as an independent adult, while simultaneously discovering just how deeply the family patterns had shaped my expectations, behaviors, and sense of self-worth. The academy had given me competence and structure, but it had not addressed the underlying conditioning that told me I was only valuable when I was useful, only worthy of attention when I accomplished something significant, and only deserving of support when I explicitly asked for it in ways that minimized inconvenience to others. My first assignment after commissioning had been to Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas for cryptologic training. The program was intensive, intellectually demanding, and required security clearances that took months to fully process. During that period, I had been both geographically and psychologically separate from my family for the first time in my life, and the distance had revealed things about our relationships that proximity had obscured. I had called home weekly during those initial months, maintaining contact because that was what good daughters did and because part of me still hoped that physical distance might somehow improve emotional connection. The calls had followed a predictable pattern. My mother would answer, ask briefly how I was doing, accept my summary response without follow-up questions, and then transition quickly to updates about Vanessa. How Vanessa was adjusting to post-college life, how she was doing in her new marketing position, how she was decorating her first apartment, who she was dating, what family drama she was currently navigating. I had tried several times to share details about my training, about the complexity of cryptologic analysis, about the satisfaction of finally understanding signals intelligence in ways that made my work meaningful. But those attempts had been met with polite acknowledgement followed by swift redirection back to Vanessa's more relatable experiences. My mother did not understand cryptology and seemed to find my explanations either boring or incomprehensible, whereas Vanessa's marketing work and relationship dramas were easily digestible topics that my mother could engage with naturally. The calls had gradually become shorter and less frequent as I realized I was performing connection rather than experiencing it. I was calling because I thought I should, because family relationships supposedly required maintenance, because I did not want to be accused of abandoning everyone after moving away. But the calls themselves provided no emotional sustenance, no genuine interest in my life, no reciprocal investment in maintaining relationship. They were checkbox interactions, brief exchanges that allowed everyone to claim we were staying in touch, while avoiding any real intimacy or understanding. One particular call during my training had crystallized this dynamic in ways I could no longer ignore. I had been selected for an advanced cryptanalysis course that only 5 people from my training cohort received, a recognition based on aptitude testing and instructor recommendations. The selection meant additional training, faster career progression, and assignment to more complex intelligence work. I had been genuinely excited and proud, wanting to share the achievement with people who were supposed to celebrate my successes. When I called home with the news, my mother had listened to my explanation and said, "That sounds complicated, Sarah. I'm sure you'll do fine with it." Oh, speaking of news, Vanessa just got promoted to senior marketing associate at her company. They're giving her a raise and she's going to be managing 2 junior staff members. We're so proud of her. Your father and I are driving up next weekend to take her out for a celebration dinner. You should send her a congratulations message. The conversation had moved on before I fully processed what had occurred. My advanced selection, which represented the top 10th percentile of my training class, had received approximately 10 seconds of acknowledgement before being displaced by Vanessa's promotion, which was being celebrated with a family trip and special dinner. The contrast was not subtle. My achievement had been complicated and therefore difficult to engage with. Vanessa's achievement was straightforward and therefore worthy of enthusiastic celebration. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.